So hi everyone, welcome to today's community poll session, focusing on the monthly theme of business, economics and human rights. It's just a reminder that this session is being recorded, so be mindful if you end up using the chat box function. My name is Ploy and I am a correspondent at Human Rights Pulse. I'm joined today by Salil Tripathi, who is a senior advisor at the Institute for Business and Human Rights, or Human Rights and Business, where his work focuses on emerging issues facing businesses and its impact on human rights. IHRB have created a video, as we mentioned a bit earlier, on the top 10 business and human rights issues that we could look out for in 2021. So please do check this out if you haven't already. And we will be touching on some of those issues briefly during this session. So hi Salil, welcome and thanks for joining us all the way from New York.
Yeah, thank you.
So if we just start off, please can you tell us about yourself, your background and the work that IHRB does?
Sure, thank you first of all for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about human rights and business, which is a topic of great interest for many people around the world. I was born in India. I studied in the US and then lived in Singapore as a reporter and then worked in Britain on human rights issues with Amnesty, then with International Alert, and now with the Institute for Human Rights and Business, where I work on emerging issues, those which are critical and crucial and which cut across themes, and try to keep pressing the idea of corporate accountability, why companies need to do more to make sure that their conduct, their actions are all consistent with international human rights standards. That's exactly what IHRB does, basically, which is to help advance policy, shape practices, and call for greater accountability. And we do it through work on the ground. We are present in Colombia, we are present in Myanmar, which, as you know, is a very difficult country these days to work out of. And we also have projects on built environment, on just transition, on migrant workers. And we worked on themes such as COVID, technology, and all business affects everything. So we work on many areas. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Your background in human rights organization itself was, I think, quite a crucial perspective when bringing it into how can business, promote and further those rights. So I'll start off by setting the scene and just ask you, what does business and human rights mean to you?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting thought because when we, do a Vox Populi interview and ask people on the streets what their view on business and human rights is, they either think that business must be terrible at human rights, right? They think about sweatshop, they think about oil and mining companies and so on. Or they even think in terms of Facebook and social media companies and their impact on hate speech and politics and so on. Or they have no opinion on if they have some informed views on that. They would say that what does business have to do with human rights anyway? Business's job is to pay taxes, create jobs, and abide by the law. Human rights is a matter for the government, and there's partly that is true. If you look at international human rights law, most of the conventions and most of the covenants and most of the treaties are signed by governments, not by companies. Governments are legitimate duty bearers for human rights. They have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill rights. Whereas what companies have to do, they have the responsibility to respect rights. And there was a process called the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights, started by Professor John Ruggie at Harvard, who was at that time, the special representative for the UN on business and human rights. And what he came up with this framework that governments have the responsibility to protect rights, companies have the responsibility to respect rights, and when there is a gap, you need a remedy. Now, when he says respect, he doesn't mean in the traditional way in which human rights law understands respect, which is do no harm. Of course, that's the starting point. And protection is making sure others don't do harm and so on. So he's not saying that companies should only do no harm because that's a very passive response. What he came up was with the idea of human rights due diligence and making sure that companies take steps to ensure that their steps don't cause harm. And they make sure that they do a human rights impact assessment and take steps to mitigate or eliminate bad practices. So if you really look at what he asks companies to do, there's a lot they have to do. And it's like peeling the layers of an onion. It just never ends. They have to keep looking at it, and every action a company takes can have positive or negative consequences. So I don't want to say that all companies are bad or all companies are good, but companies do things which are good or bad. In some cases, the impacts are good. Some cases, impacts are bad. And when they're bad, they may be intended or unintended. Sometimes companies want to do things which are terrible. I mean, if you're an arms supplier, weapons supplier, I'm sure, your intent is not very noble, except unless you're giving to law enforcement authorities in law abiding countries. I mean, if you're selling arms to Myanmar, that's a different story today, right? But sometimes you don't intend it, and yet there might be effects because you are linked to the incident or you have contributed to the incident. So it becomes very, very complicated as we unpack, and which means that human rights is something as an idea that companies have to imbibe it completely. And it's not something that can be siloed and a few people look after it and rest of the people can do their business. It has to be a governing philosophy for the company.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Like you said, I personally have a commercial background, but I have an interest and a hobby in, talking about human rights and protecting it. And I've always thought, are they separate? Do I have to be doing them side, on its own as opposed to side by side? But actually, businesses operate in a world full of human beings. So every interaction has a direct impact on our rights. And yeah, it's just really interesting to be able to hear from you and from IHRB, because you've got such a global perspective to see, where these rights are being engaged in what countries and what lessons we can learn from that to remedy other issues going forwards. So what has been the historic relationship between human rights and business and economics?
So you could take the negative view, right? The glass half empty, or even 2/3 empty argument. And if we look at a lot of the global history, business and human rights are intertwined. When we look at some really egregious instances of human rights abuses, colonialism, slavery, at the root of that, there was a business. I grew up in India, and, we were colonized by the East India Company initially. It was a business that came to buy products from India and ended up governing the country. There were people from Africa and from Asia who were taken against their will to work in other parts on plantations, often as slaves. And who was doing that? There were companies who were doing it. Fortunately, we have moved on from that, and now we have the rule of law. We have systems in place to make sure that companies act right. And companies are today very quick to denounce what they call modern forms of slavery. They have statements on that, and they're active in that regard. So mercifully and thankfully, we are not in that kind of a situation. But if we look at the interaction of business and human rights, then whether it is oil mining and gas companies, Shell in Nigeria, BP in Colombia, other companies like Freeport McMoran in Indonesia, or if we look at apparel, the clothes we wear, whether it is made by child labor, whether it is made by women working in unsafe conditions in Southeast Asia or South Asia, those are all legitimate questions that come in. And then as we, again, peel the layers of the onion, it's not just these two industries that have an issue. If you're in the pharmaceutical sector, you develop the vaccine. At what price do you sell it? Do you want intellectual property rights for it? When there's a pandemic, should you wait on ceremony, or should you just increase the supply and let more people produce the vaccine? When you test a drug on somebody, are you taking an informed consent of that person? The data that you and I put up on Facebook or Twitter and all that, who gets to own it? Who is it shared with? Who does the mining? Now, if we start, unpacking all these, then we see that almost every action a company takes has an impact which can be adverse for human rights. And therefore, what's necessary is that for companies to make sure that the impacts are only positive. Now, of course, paying taxes and creating jobs are extremely important things. But there are things they can do beyond that. And we know examples from the past, like in South Africa during the apartheid years, where companies followed what were called the Sullivan Principles. And the Sullivan Principles were named after a preacher from Philadelphia called Reverend Leon Sullivan, who was on the board of GM, the automaking company in America. And he said that, okay, if you are operating in South Africa, I agree with you that you are not implementing apartheid. You are not thought of the system. You do not believe in discrimination. So prove it. And how do companies prove it? by making sure that when they recruit people, they are race blind, by making sure that they pay equal work, equal pay principles there, so that a white and a black employee would have the same, at the same level of job, same kind of salaries and benefits. And what they did, something that was truly revolutionary, was that some companies promoted black employees who ended up being managers of the white employees. Now that was upheaval, it caused an upheaval in South Africa because these things never happened. So companies can play a role. When in the United States there was a law passed in one particular state which said that you could not, if you're in a state government owned building, you could only go to a changing area or a bathroom if it was if it was open for the gender that you were assigned with at birth and on your birth certificate, right? So it was an anti-trans law, as it were. And PayPal, Deutsche Bank, companies like decided to pull out of that state. When Equal Marriage Act came into being in the United States, again, the Supreme Court was listening to the case. Several companies, I think more than 100 companies, wrote what are called amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, saying that we have nothing against marriage equality, and it's fine if people from the same sex want to marry each other. And of course, the court ultimately ruled in that direction, and it happened. So I think there are companies which are speaking up on human rights, issuing statements, defending that, and that's a good thing. And I think what we expect, and we meaning you, I, and all the people who care for business and human rights expect from companies, is to adhere to the standards, uphold international standards, and advance them in the process of doing business.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I suppose with the business and commercial world, everything's always evolving very fast, whether it be new technology or, the climate crisis. Businesses are always responding to those. But I suppose we should then be doing it in a rights-based manner and have it at the forefront of our minds. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. And then another question that I had, which I think might be a very difficult question to answer, is, can human rights and business and economics work in tandem? Where human rights, people want to preserve individual rights and, for example, workers, but the very nature of businesses in the commercial world is to make money. Can it work together?
It's a fascinating question. And 50 years ago, Milton Friedman wrote that famous essay in which he said that the only business that business has is business. Corporate social responsibility is a nice idea. The word he used was, this is creeping socialism. That is what he was worried about, that if the business has a responsibility, it's only towards its shareholders and not beyond. But the interesting thing is that now companies have a more enlightened view that, take something like climate, if people stop driving cars in the United States, it may have a positive impact on Bangladesh because it might mean less climate change and therefore less likelihood of cyclones hitting that country. But they are not able to make that connection. But we are in an interlinked, globalized world where everything has an impact on everybody else's action. So I think what companies are realizing is that, and that a lot of companies are making that commitments on the climate arena, by reducing their carbon footprint, by talking about what they're doing, supporting the Paris process, and so on. So companies believe that by responding to a community bigger than their own is a good thing. Now take the idea about, profit potential. You could be in a country and you can take the easy way out and only recruit people from the top 5 universities. But that's where you might find that it's only people of a certain ethnicity who are admitted. Or suppose it's a country where there's discrimination against women to get higher education. Most companies will tell you that whenever a company narrows down its pool of applicants or narrows down its customer base or supplier base, it makes suboptimal choices. It doesn't make the right choice because you simply don't know what you're missing out on. And so I think when systems like apartheid are built, they're built on the premise that, we will do what we want to do and we are only going to hire white people. What is going to happen is there may be brilliant people who are black, brown, and other ethnicities in South Africa. They don't get access to that. So I think profit potential, if you truly want to be profitable, you should be fair and equal and not discriminatory. So I think that's where there is a commonality of interest there. Companies do want to reach out to the largest number of customers and all that. So you could say, but let's not overegg the pudding, as they say in the phrase. Let's not say that Therefore, companies are human rights actors. Their actions have human rights consequences, but they cannot, it is not, it's mutual exclusivity, because companies are good for a purpose, which is to generate wealth and profit. But in the same essay, Milton Friedman had said that they must do within the confines of law, and which is where law becomes important, that you have to make sure that there are certain limits placed, that what you can and cannot do. Of course, a company would do very well if it had children at very low wages, and and send them inside mines, as Britain used to do 200 years ago, 100 years ago. In Charles Dickens's time, in London, stories are full of coal mines and all that in Britain, where children used to work there, right? I mean, and obviously Britain moved on from that because it was unconscionable, immoral, and over time it became illegal. And I think therefore pure pursuit of profit is never desirable, and you always have limits of the law. And what we want to make sure is that those laws are guided by human rights principles. And I think when that sweet spot is reached, is where seeking profits and protecting lives can come together.
That's a really, really good answer. It's something that I've been thinking about for a little while, and I had no clue. So thanks for shining a light on that. And yes, I suppose if we are talking about it more and trying to bridge that gap, at least it's on its way to getting there, which is a positive thinking.
Yep.
So if we could just talk about some or maybe all of the 10 issues that you highlighted in the video, that would be really, really interesting. So if we start off by the first one, which touched on the redesigning of supply chains.
Yeah. No, I will do that, but let me give you the rationale of it, that when we say these are the top 10, we don't rank order them. It doesn't mean that the first one that we'll talk about is the most important issue. What we see is that there are a host of issues which are important for business and human rights. But this year, we believe these 10 matter. It doesn't mean that those which are not here, such as armed conflicts, such as gender diversity, such as LGBT issues, are not important. Just that this year, these issues strike us as being important. And we've been doing it for 10 years. So you asked me about the redesigning of the supply chain. And I think that has become important, because I think what COVID has taught us is that while there is a lot of virtue in having a seamless coordination between a place where goods are made and the place where they are sold, it's just wonderful. And it's very efficient, and you and I are able to buy T-shirts and jeans at relatively cheap prices, which otherwise would be not possible. But there are costs, the cost of pollution, the cost to environment, but more important, that cost to workers' rights and workers' wages. So what we wanted to know was to try to find out what can be done to improve the lot, and what are the responsibilities and this became very crucial, because as soon as you had the situation of lockdowns, some factories had to close down. And at that time, the cost for that lockdown was borne by the workers. Companies were able to preserve their cash position and liquidity and so on. But workers were the ones who were suffering the most. So the need for safety net becomes important, and some kind of streamlining we see happening. But companies are going to pay a lot of attention to their supply chain. And in the process of doing that, we would urge that don't only make the idea of efficiency and profits your sole criterion, but look at the impacts on the workers who are working there.
Yes, that's really important point, because the backbone of the business is the workers. Without them, you can have robots, I suppose, but at some point there will need to be human beings behind all these transactions. So yeah, I hope the businesses take the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic and put in structures to support those workers going forwards, in a pandemic world or not. And then the other issue that you mentioned is about balancing the rights of track and tracing. And obviously that's very topical, because almost every country has, have some sort of programs or apps in place to do that. So how can the balance be struck in dealing with preventing the pandemic and enabling people to have their freedoms and the right to privacy?
Yeah, so I think it is important to start with, to state the obvious, that yes, preventing the spread of the virus is a responsibility of the state and all of us. So to that extent, you have something called Syracuse principles in the human rights law, which basically says that when there is a public health emergency or other kinds of, you can do what is called a derogation of human rights, which means certain rights can be suspended. So when you have a disease going on, you can say that we will not have the right to free assembly because you don't want 10,000 people gathering either for a rave or to the beach or to see a cricket match or to protest against something, because then the likelihood is going to increase. So governments have the right to impose restrictions. The issue that once you start gathering that data, who controls it, who is it shared with, what is it used for, how long is it stored, when is it destroyed, these become important criteria. So when we say that, I mean, if, for example, you're tracking and tracing a person, the important thing is anonymizing the data. So you'll be able to identify the phone and you'll be able to identify the person and track the person down only if there is a red flag that emerges out of it. But otherwise, you don't need to. It's not like we are all going to have to carry these electronic gadgets on our hands. And then we are prisoners, right? Jails do that in many parts of the world, where, if a prisoner is no longer likely to be threat to the society in a violent way, then they are given this little thing to wear on their ankle or on their wrist, and that tells the police. And we don't want to live in that kind of almost dystopian Huxleyan future. This is not even Orwellian future. That's what we are talking about. And if that's where we want to go, then I think it is very important that whoever controls the data does it legitimately, proportionately, because it is necessary, in a transparent manner, and then it is they take steps, of course, that it doesn't get misused by anybody, and that requires a system of checks and balances and accountability.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that's sort of enshrined in law. Is that
Yeah.
how to protect
Yeah.
the best?
Absolutely, it needs to be. Yeah.
And then another issue that was raised, which I was a bit naive about and unaware, was about workers who are stranded at sea. Why are they stranded at sea, and whose responsibility is it to bring them back?
Yeah, so I mean, the responsibility rests with the states. And what's happened is that the workers who are stranded at sea are basically people who work on ships that take the cargo from point A to B. And they typically, when they go to the destination, they have some time off and they can go and mingle in that country and come back. But because they are in a close proximity on the ship, and because of the virus, a lot of countries put up barriers that they will not be allowed to come in. And as soon as you stop people from commuting, you basically make them stranded. They have problems of access to, I mean, the mental health issue. You're stuck on a ship for like endlessly without knowing when it will end. That is a problem. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are in this situation, and they are not able to come out. Now, the root of the word quarantine, actually it was from medieval era, is quarant, which is 40 in French, right? Quarant, oh, yeah. And so that was the rule, that you were on a ship and you were kept outside the port for 40 days, because that was the idea about quarantine. And after that, you were supposed to come out. Now, I'm not, so this is like way beyond 40. And, so I think that there are creative ways of handling it, such as going there, testing the workers. I mean, helicopters can go and you can test the workers. And if they're safe, to let them free, let them return to their home. That does not happen. It's stuck in a logjam, and that needs to break.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine. And I suppose they might still need to be working there, whilst they're stranded. And like you say, mental health and motivation and maybe depression might start to sink in. So yeah, I mean, I'm hoping I'll do some more research on that and try to find a way.
There's a lot of good work around it done by the unions who are representing the workers, but it's just that we live in a stage and time where people are extremely reluctant to let people in to countries. The kind of quarantine restrictions that are being placed. I mean, if I were to come to the UK tomorrow, I'm in New York right now, I believe I'll have to spend 8 days in a hotel or, in a quarantine. Although I have been vaccinated and I would be coming with a certificate showing that, I've done the PCR and the test and all that, and still that would happen. Now, I mean, there is, so I think those kinds of restrictions we need to learn more about. That if a legitimate authority has certified that you don't have it, then is it still necessary to do that? And I think the solution is simple. Sometimes it's a question of political will. I mean, governments,
Yeah.
as it is, there's a rising xenophobia in many parts of the world, and this all becomes part of that.
Yeah. Which is quite sad because human rights is human rights. It shouldn't
Yeah,
be a political issue.
yeah.
Sad. Anyways, next on to the next issue is about the office and how most of us have been working from home, but now that vaccines are in sight, and how do we, reintegrate back into that environment in a human rights way?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, what kind of office will exist in future. So many people like the idea of working from home, and some people find it incredibly depressing. I mean, in the past, you could just pop over to the cubicle next to you and have a chat, about last night's football match or whatever it is. But you're not able to do that anymore. We do have team meetings on a Zoom call like this one, and you have a banter for 2 or 3 minutes. But you're not able to have a human conversation on a water cooler and all that. So there is that part of it. A lot of work can be done the way we are doing it right now, but a lot of work cannot be done like that, because you do want to spread things across the table and look at it and all that. And yes, all of it is possible on a screen, but there are limitations to that. The most important thing to note is that there's a study by Stanford University, and I'm not sure of the exact figure, but I think it's 40%. But the study shows that the only 40% of the jobs, as you and I know, can be performed remotely. 60% of what we call work requires you to be somewhere else, right? So what it means is that you would need people to have to, it's not simply the cleaning jobs and janitor jobs and waiters job, but there are engineering jobs. There are lots of jobs in many fields which require people to be elsewhere physically. Also, the assumption that working from home is great because it reduces costs and all that is fine, but working from home may not be conducive. In theory, if it's a family of four with two growing children who are in school, you basically need 4 laptops or 4 screens, because the two kids have to study, and the school is now also remote. I mean, in many parts of the world, it is still remote. And the two parents, whether it's two men, two women, or husband and wife, whatever it is, they also would need it for their own work. So who is going to pay for that technology? How many companies are going to be able to afford it? And then the other part is that sometimes people are in hostile relationships at home. People have caregiving responsibilities. So what do they do when somebody is doing that, and the person who's being looked after will then make legitimate demands on the caregiver that, come look after me, my back is paining and massage it for me. But you can't, because it's your work day. I mean, if you were at office, you were able to do that. But once you're at home, it's harder. It's particularly harder on women. And one sad statistic that has come out, I was reading some reports in newspapers, that a lot of women are now dropping out. It was always thought that flexibility and working from home would be good for women, because then they can be doing two. But actually, they're finding it much harder, and some of them are opting out of work altogether, and that attrition level has increased. So I think companies are going to need to think a lot more about it and think of more creative ways and working things out, so that they can come up with systems in place, so that there are ways in which they are able to work together. And also that means having wider offices, bigger offices, space between them, and so on. So we're still struggling to find out what this means.
Yes, definitely. I think it's all a work in progress, but I think those points definitely need to be borne in mind by the companies and businesses when they're, restructuring or redesigning the new office space.
Mm-hmm.
And then another issue is about forced labour. And to me, in 2021, why does this still exist?
Because there are governments and companies which benefit from it, and you have this as a problem certainly in cotton fields in many parts of the world. People have no choice but to work. Forced labor doesn't necessarily mean putting people in shackles and removing them, but as you said, used to happen in some of the former Soviet republics in the past, where as soon as it was vacation time, which coincided with the time when cotton had to be harvested, school children were herded to work. There are other parts of the world where community service and community work is taken as part of the social contract. Myanmar used to have that problem, and it still has that problem, and it becomes effectively forced labor. But people are, they're not able to exercise that right. And the same questions have now come up in the context of Xinjiang in Western China, where a lot of companies are being, it's an issue of reckoning for them. They're being asked to respond to it. Some of them have spoken out, and therefore there has been a backlash against them from Chinese authorities. So I think we are in that system, and which is the reason why so many governments have signed on to legislation about modern slavery, and also do and act in ways so that that is eliminated.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose like what you were saying before, glass half empty, glass half full. I guess it's more of a longer journey to get everywhere on the same page. And then another issue is climate migration, which I think it's where communities are having to leave because, for example, climate issues affects the way that they can live their lives. Are you able to explain a bit more about that, and maybe about the case of Ione Tota, if that's how you say it?
Yeah, so I think climate migration, I don't want to go into the details of the specifics of the case per se, but what I can certainly talk about is that climate migration is a reality. And I think it ties in with two other things that are going on. One is there is still a denial on the part of some governments, which is in not trying to look at all at the impacts of the country. And there's a kind of a denial. And we're still in a situation where people are looking at what it means when people are in a context where they have to leave. So there is that part of it. And the other is the xenophobia, which is also at the back of it, and in terms of what that might mean to people. So I think we have to accept that there is going to be climate. And, it has always happened. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, people have moved from one part to another. Sahel and Eastern Kenya are regions where these things have happened. I mean, I grew up in India. I've written a book on Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has a real existential fear, and not just fear, but well-founded concern that cyclones and that would come and affect them. And they had the worst cyclone in living memory in 1970 called Bola. And it is going to lead to climate refugees. So we are going to live in a time where people will be driven out of where they live because of an exceptionally harsh climate or because of a climatic catastrophe. And we need to think of ways, and one of the major problems there, of course, there's a human rights law. If we really look at the human rights law, what has happened there is that you have a situation where the definition of a refugee is driven by political factors. You have to have a well-founded fear of persecution or prosecution, and therefore you cannot go back, and therefore the non-refoulement principle in the international refugee law. But the refugees are driven certainly by economic and political factors, but we are increasingly going to see refugees coming out due to climatic factors. And I dare say, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I dare say the human rights community and the international community are going to have to reopen the definition of how they view a refugee. And if they do reopen, they will have to make concessions for that. And that does mean that countries which are more in better climatic situations and all that, they will have to be more open. And it's going to be extremely hard given what we know about how the world looks at people from different parts of the world and how the whole xenophobic argument has been playing out.
Yes, definitely. I think this is a topic which we will need to keep a close eye on, especially because, like you say, businesses are global. Just because you have a headquarters, say, in America, but the supply chain might be, for example, in India or somewhere, or other remote parts of the world, and they're actually bearing the burden of, pollution or rising sea levels. So just because it's not at home doesn't mean we should forget about it. So I think that's a really interesting topic to look out for. So if we just have a quick quiz through the last three, because we've got about 4 minutes. Race and ethnicity, that's again very topical at the moment. And I think there's a lot of arguments to say that change needs to happen, but change has to be structural. How can businesses do that without seeming like they're just doing it for tokenism?
Yeah, so I think I'll be quick because, as you said, we are running out of time. But I think in race, what they should think is not in terms of statements and public relations support and saying that we will hire more people from minorities. That's great. What they should look at is when they take certain business decisions because of the pandemic, such as closing down factories or streamlining their supply chain. Who's going to bear the burden of that? If they close down factories, and if you are in the United States, are Black people more likely to lose jobs? If you close down factories in another part of the world, I mean, is it that, or if you're going to have fewer suppliers, does it mean suppliers from poor countries are going to get affected? And is there a racial dimension to that? I think those are the kind of intersectional analyses that companies will have to do.
Yeah, definitely. And then standards fragmentation.
Yeah, I think what's happened is that you have the UN guiding principles on one hand, but more and more standards are emerging. So what's happening is that you have the OECD guidance on certain products and services. You have EU guidance. Now that UK is out of the EU, UK will have its own standard, and it leads to proliferation, and it leads to more companies being compelled to compare one standard with the other. Which is the gold standard? I mean, is it the European GDPR that they must apply everywhere? Or is it something that they have to apply only in certain cases in terms of data protection? And I think there needs to be some way to have clarity around it. And there has to be certain uniformity without dumbing them down and lowering standards.
Yeah. And I suppose trying to put a positive spin on that is, if, these new standards are being created, perhaps the gaps that currently exist in human rights and business world can be rectified in that process as well.
Yep, absolutely.
And then the last one is transition finance, which we might get cut off on.
Yeah, so I'll be very quick and make a very quick transition. Essentially, it means that we are moving from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. In the process, make sure that the workers and communities that are affected are looked after. And that means the financing that is done should make sure that the vulnerable are protected, which is a very broad way of responding. But do look at our Just Transitions report, which will give you a lot of ideas.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to everyone for joining. Check out the organization's video as well, which we'll link after. Thank you for joining us, Salil. It's been really, really insightful. So thank you for your time.
Lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Have a nice day. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.